Thank you, Prof. Hoffman, for inviting us to talk. I'm going to start with apologies. One of the reasons we have a lot of people on the slide is that we're going to talk about a very large collaborative effort spearheaded by Kerstin Koenen, who unfortunately is out with the flu. And so I am going to be trying to do her justice and introduce the large research project and capacity building project that we've been working on. And then I will turn it to our colleague, Dr. Akena. Unfortunately, our postdoc, Dr. Lerato Majara, is off on a family emergency and was unable to attend as well. So I'm going to give some background. Why are we interested in studying genetics on the African continent or outside the African continent and outside of the populations we usually study? The greatest genetic diversity is found in Africa. The slide that you see in front of you on the y-axis are variants, number of variants per genome. So how variable you see in the genomes, and along the x-axis are different populations. Anybody that's done any genetics are familiar with a lot of these acronyms. But over on the left in Europe, FIN stands for a Finnish population, where you could see the most diversity. On the right in Africa, you see populations like the Lua and the Yoruba, Lua in Kenya and Yoruba originating in present-day Nigeria. So there's more information, there's more diversity in the African genome. However, historically in genetics, we haven't been studying a lot of diversity. So this slide is made possible by one of our colleagues who also is doing work in Africa, Sekum Fatumo, looking at the diversity in data that we use in our big GWAS studies. So the vast majority of data on the y-axis, you have number of individual data points and individuals that have contributed to GWAS studies. The vast majority come from people of European descent. And on the right, you see the actual distribution of these large classes of racial classes and ethnicity classes. And you could see that that red portion is actually closer to about 16% of the global population. So these discussions were started many years ago, and this was noticed many years ago. And these initial discussions that were started between Kerstin Koenen, Steve Hyman, and actually our former dean, Michelle Williams, back in 2014, was how do we go about diversifying the data that we use in in GWAS studies? But more importantly, how do we go about it in a way that ensures equity, that ensures we're not repeating the sins of the past, and that everybody involved in the research actually profits from the research. So that's how NeuroGap, which stands for the Neuropsychiatric Genetics of African Populations study, was started. NeuroGap has three components to it. It has a research component, it has a training component, and it has an ethics component. And today we're going to talk about the research component and the training component. And I'm very glad that our colleague, who's the PI of many of our Ugandan sites, has come here to visit us in Boston in the winter to talk a lot about, tell us a little bit about what we're doing in Uganda. So Dr. Akena.
Okay. Thank you very much, Lori, and good afternoon, everybody. I have minimized that, so I hope I'm still being seen.
You're fine. Just
okay.
Keep clicking.
Fantastic. So my name is Dickens Akena. I'm a psychiatrist from Makerere University, and I'm here to talk about the work that we're doing in Africa. So Lori has already introduced the topic of the NeuroGap, so which was the neuropsychiatric genetics of African populations, psychosis study, which is collaboration between the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, the Broad Institute, and then 4 different countries in Africa. And each of those countries has its own PI. Myself being the Ugandan PI, Solomon Tefara from Ethiopia, Atwoli Lukoye and Simon Kariuki from Kenya. In Eastern Kenya is Simon Kariuki, and then in Western Kenya was Atwoli, Zuki Zingela from the Eastern Cape, and Professor Dan Stein from the Western Cape, with Kerstin Koenen as the overall PI. So what did we do? We collected data and we conducted this study across multiple sites in Africa. And within those countries, there were also still multiple sites within the country. So as you can see, there were multiple sites in South Africa from the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape in the southern part of South Africa. In Uganda, we collected data from the central parts of Uganda, the western part, and the northern and the northwestern part, and in central Ethiopia, and then also in eastern Kenya, and then in western Kenya as well. Okay, so what exactly did we do? We collected data from cases and controls. So cases basically were people with psychosis, operationally defined as somebody who had either schizophrenia or a bipolar affective disorder that was not a result of a substance use disorder. And then controls basically were individuals without a history of a mental illness, as shown by the psychosis screening questionnaire. So all participants provided informed consent, written informed consent, and the research assistants trained, bachelor's level and above, would then read the consent to the participants. And then after that, we administered the UBAC questionnaire as an assessment of whether they had understood the consenting process. This was an interactive process that in the beginning would take about an hour. The minimum time for obtaining this consent is about 45 minutes. So it's a long, lengthy process. And I think towards the end, we understood and we appreciated why it was important to take consent through this process. So once the participants had signed the consent, they would then provide a saliva sample from where we extracted DNA. If the person didn't score up 14.5 and above on 3 attempts, it would be considered that they had not fully appreciated the reason for reasons for participating in the study. And this was made to look like an interactive process, not like an exam. So we really tried to emphasize to the research assistants that this was not an exam. So it shouldn't have looked like somebody had failed to pass the UBAC. And after participants had been enrolled in the study, which took anything between 1.5 to 2 hours, then we administered demographic questionnaires, and from where we actually asked participants about their ancestry, their mothers, their fathers, their grandfathers, where they came from, what languages they speak at home, where they stay, and administered the mini for all cases. And then the PSQ, the psychosis screening questionnaires to the controls, the Kessler 10 to the controls, life events checklist to everybody, the assist and the CD to everybody. And then we also took measures of weight, height, blood pressure, and then we reviewed the charts for the medications that the participants were taking and how long they had been in hospital. So what did we do with the samples, the DNA? So the participants gave us saliva samples in an origin kit, and then we conducted an extraction of the DNA from local labs. So these labs were based in Addis Ababa, in Kampala, at the UCT in Cape Town, and then Moi in Kenya, and then Kilifi. So half of the extracted DNA plus the raw samples of the saliva remained in country, and then the other half was shipped to the Broad Institute for sequencing. So how many people did we engage with? We engaged with 42,953, almost 43,000 people from Uganda and Ethiopia and Kenya and South Africa. So there were cases and controls almost matched on 50-50%. The Ugandan and the Ethiopian figures were exact, and they were exact, but there were other discussions that happened as to why the numbers shouldn't have been exactly exact. Okay, so this was a lot of work. It was very extensive. Maybe for purposes of just putting some of these things in context, the African continent is perhaps the size of North America or South America. Uganda is a little small country, smaller than many states in in the US, but there are over 35 ethnicities in that small place. So there's a lot of diversity. So a lot of people from Uganda came from the north, from the west, and then from the south. So there was a lot of migration towards what we currently call the present Great Lakes regions. The reasons were many, and the reasons included fertile soils, good climate, and stuff like that. So as you may see, that the East Africans actually spoke lots of languages. So there was a lot of ethnicity between Kenya and Uganda. In South Africa and Ethiopia, there was, not a lot of ethnicities differences. The number of languages spoken in Uganda and Kenya are more than 30. But these are like distinct languages. So if you go to like the language that I speak, which is Luo, there may be 3 other similar languages to it with just differences in dialect as well. So there were 110 ethnicities. We consented participants from using 10 languages, different languages. And primary languages spoken by all our participants was 103. It's worth noting that we translated all these instruments in 9 different languages. And then they were culturally adapted. And then we did the validity and reliability of the Mini in 2 languages, which was Swahili and Luganda in Uganda and Kenya. And so this process of the language translations and then culture adaptations took place before we started to collect data. And the reason was that we really wanted to be sure that the information that we're getting was not affected by the languages that were being spoken. So what exactly happened with the DNA is that, like you see, there were 13,000 participants enrolled in Ethiopia, 12,000 in Uganda, 9,000 in South Africa, and then 8,000 in Kenya as well. And so samples with the analyzable genetic data was almost 96% of all the samples. So the ones that were not analyzable, maybe the DNA did not pass the QC tests in the labs as they were done. More than 98%, 99%, more than 99% of all the samples were shipped to South Africa. I mean, to the Broad Institute. It's worth noting that if you have 42,953 samples, sometimes maybe 1 or 2 things may go wrong. But overall, almost 100% of the samples were sequenced. Okay, so what happened from the start? We wanted to recontact participants so that we could follow them up if there was need. And 96% of all participants allowed for future contact, and this was very good, which basically means that follow-up studies were possible, as we are going to see in 2 other studies that we are now involved in. So we launched 2 other studies, one on PTSD and one on OCD, suicidality, and hedonia. Those 2 studies are NIH funded. So in 2022, May, we did our first follow-up study for PTSD, and the participants would be called by research assistants. So we'd go into the data, into the Mrs. Stroud. What did we do? We would go into the archive, not the archives. We would go and the word is disappearing. But would look for information about the participants, get their phone numbers, and then contact them. Okay, that word has vanished from my head. I'm sorry. So we would get them and then call them up and ask them questions about, would screen them for PTSD and trauma using the life events checklist. And those who scored more than 3 on the PC-PTSD, which is the cutoff, were then called to be assessed for post-traumatic stress disorder using the PCL5. And this we did in Uganda and in Kenya. And as you can see, the ratios were almost 50-50 for males and cases and controls. And then in August 2023, through the NIH funded supplement study, we also started to contact participants again, and then administer anhedonia questionnaire and discrimination questionnaires and as step 1, and then in step 2, we call them to the facility for detailed assessments. Okay, so, and this data basically is up to December of 2023. In Uganda, so far, we were able to get 568 participants recalled for step 2, and then in Kenya, 635 and then 568 in Kenya. So what happened exactly is that we decided to look into the traumatic events that people were experiencing of our life events checklist assessment, and a huge number of people from the African continent endorse being exposed to traumatic events. 88%, at least one trauma in Kenya, and then 65%, at least one trauma in Uganda. More than 4 traumas is endorsed by almost a quarter of the populations that we studied. So clearly, this is a big problem. And then, what are the kinds of trauma that our study population participants are exposed to? Road traffic accidents. If you've been to many parts of Africa, it is ill-advised to use certain modes of transport because the risk of getting involved in an accident is rather high. The roads are narrow. The vehicles are not in a very good mechanical state. And then physical assault between husband and wife, spouses, children, adults, whatever the case may be. In many parts of the world, people still solve their problems physically. Assault with a weapon was observed more in Uganda than in Kenya. And the reasons are that, Uganda has been exposed to a little bit more civil strife compared to the neighbors, just like exposure to combat as well. So life-threatening injury and illness, severe human suffering, observing sudden death are all the experiences that we observed. So let's dive a little bit into the Ugandan setting. A small country, but those are all geographical areas separated by rivers and mountains, and those are districts. So there are 2 districts in northern Uganda, one called Arua, northwestern Uganda. Arua is closer to the Democratic Republic of Congo, which some of you may have heard about, and Gulu is basically closer to South Sudan. So what happened here was that we assessed for PTSD using the PCL5, and then we documented the number of people who have a score greater than 33. And you can clearly see that there are very high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder in the northwest and the northern parts of the country, and much lower rates in the southern part of the country. We don't know exactly why, apart from the fact that these areas were exposed to, people from this area were exposed to lots of civil strifes in the past. So we don't know whether it's just the fact that people are exposed to wars, or maybe it's just that they are genetically predisposed to developing PTSD. We don't know. We'll figure that out. But that said, part of the PTSD work that we're involved in also requires us to be engaged with the PGC for PTSD. And clearly, as you can see, a lot of the data that we have in the PGC for PTSD basically is likely of people from European ancestry, with very little people of African ancestry involved or contributing to this data. And of course, this means that Africa continues to, lag behind with regards to contribution to these important things. And yet we know that there's a lot of genetic diversity from the African continent. So then, because of that, the data from the findings of neurogap psychosis, the follow-up, the lack of data that we are contributing as Africans to the ancestry populations. We applied to the NIH and got funding to investigate the genetics of PTSD in people of African ancestries. This was funded in 2023, and we are happy to say that, you know, the work has commenced. So we are now collecting data, and so far, as of January of 2024, we have enrolled 202 participants in Uganda and 278 participants in Kenya. So what do we mean by not eligible? These are individuals who have not scored more than 3 on the PTSD screening instrument. And then what other instruments are we giving to these individuals? We are assessing them for childhood trauma life events checklist, depression, anxiety, substance use, and also we are doing a chart review, and we are still collecting DNA using from the saliva of these participants. So this is our current work that we are now doing. Our sample size is 4,000 for each of the 2 countries. Thank you. Thank you, Laurie.
Thank you, Dr. Akena, for talking about our research that we're doing together. I'm just going to jump in and talk a little bit about the training aspect of our program, and talk a little bit about the bigger scope. So you heard an excellent talk about the work that's going on in Uganda particularly. And I will say the last few slides emphasizing the new PTSD project and the NIMH R01, which is a very large R01, is exactly the vision that was had at the beginning when Dr. Conan and Dr. Hyman and Dean Williams got together to talk about this.
Dr. Chipnick, do you have slides or
Yes, I do. I'm
Okay.
sorry,
Thank
we
you.
do.
Sorry, no, that's fine. Otherwise, I thought unshare, but please go ahead. Yeah.
No, I apologize. I
No.
am ad-libbing a little bit to just point out and lead to the next thing, which is there was a big concerted effort to start this and build this project and build up diversity in the genome, and hopefully in working together with our partners that they would then take all the infrastructure that was built, all the knowledge that was gained, and move it forward for independent projects in our different sites. So when this all started, I was brought in to talk a little bit about how we can do this in a way that is more equitable. And I always use this slide, although I guess it's getting a little dated. This was a slide from the American Society of Human Genetics conference in 2016. I was actually not at that conference, but it was one of the opening slides to say, isn't this wonderful? So many people are at this conference. For those not in the genetics world, it is the biggest genetics conference every year. It's so wonderful. We have all this diverse group of researchers. Now, people who know me all took pictures of the slides and started sending them to my phone, because you can notice very quickly that there is a continent that's missing from this particular map. And the representation from the African continent was completely missing. So the question that always came up with us is, we're going to collect all this data. Who's going to analyze all this data? So that was the impetus for the GINGER program. GINGER stands for the Global Initiative for Neuropsychiatric Genetics Education and Research. The overall goal of the program is to improve and achieve equity in mental health by expanding capacity to conduct large-scale psychiatric genetic epidemiology in low and middle income countries. That was our initial goal. We wanted to build our collaborations, train the next generation of researchers, and ultimately reduce the burden of serious mental illness through research. So this program was built in a way that we brought in input from as many people as we could. We wanted it to be a program that we could bring together all our collaborators across Africa and other places that we're working with. And 7 years ago this month, we brought in experts in pedagogy, in genetics, in psychiatry, all of our PIs from all of our sites in Africa to Boston for 2 days to really help work together, build the program, think about what is needed to be a successful psychiatric geneticists in Uganda or in Kenya or Ethiopia or wherever our sites are, and work together to put this program together. So the picture you have on the slide was our first group of volunteers, our first group of fellows. There's a little Peace Corps jump there. These are our first group of fellows who came to Boston in the summer of 2017. Seems like an eternity ago, for a 2-week workshop here at the Broad and Harvard. And throughout the next 3 years, we had virtual classrooms where they met every week online, learning different skills, working together. The next slide, you'll see where everybody is coming from. I like to joke that we were doing Zoom classrooms before they became popular. And then during this time, we also took people from here, from Harvard School of Public Health, from the Broad Institute, students and postdocs, going to all of the different collaborative sites that we work with, doing skills training, opening it up to a larger population, making a lot of introductions to from our early career researchers here to many of the researchers in our collaborative sites, which have also led to further collaboration. And bringing it all together at the end and working and encouraging and mentoring our fellows to write their own grants and to transition into independent researchers. Here, we were able to fit all of our fellows that we've had so far. I had to confirm that. So we've had fellows from all the 4 countries that we are currently working in NeuroGap. The ones that are outlined in green are our current fellows who are in their last year of the Ginger Fellowship. Those outlined in black are our fellows from our first cohort. And they come from not just various different countries, but they come from various different backgrounds. We have psychiatrists and psychologists who are interested in getting in genetics. We have geneticists who are interested in learning about mental health. We have somebody with a background in nursing. We have somebody with a chemist who used to work for a beer company, I believe, who decided they wanted to go into research as well. I will point out that they all are working and have jobs, some in clinic and some outside clinic at their home institutions. Ginger is meant to be a hybrid program. And the idea being that we're going to work with them, mentor them. They're going to teach us about how to do research at their sites as well, so that they can build up the next generation of geneticists at their respective institutions. So this is a 1-slide summary of some of the successes that we've had over the years. I want to also point out that while I'm talking about NeuroGap, which is in the African populations, we also have collaborations in Mexico and other areas. So the top picture is actually a training that we did in Mexico. All the other pictures, yes, are trainings that we've done around different parts of Africa or in the US. We've built hundreds of hours of virtual classroom, hundreds of hours of workshops. Our fellows have gone on and published many, many papers, including multiple papers that have more than one of our Ginger Fellows on it. So one of the wonderful things that have come out of this is that many of our fellows that are in different countries, where historically they might have been isolated from each other, are now working together across Africa, building intra-Africa collaborations and publishing papers that we are not part of, which is great, which is exactly the vision that we were having. I was at this point going to turn it over to the second bullet point, which is Dr. Lerato Majara, who was a Ginger Fellow #1. She matriculated at University of Cape Town. She's originally from the Eastern Cape, and she was going to talk about the research she's doing here in her postdoc fellowship, looking at polygenic risk scores. Unfortunately, she had a family emergency, but I'm commenting on this to say hopefully she will be invited back at some point to be able to talk about this. We have a fellow from Akena's has matriculated at Makerere University, who actually was the chemist who has gone on to submit a Wellcome Trust grant and receive the Wellcome Trust Emerging Leader Award. I should comment, he also submitted a K grant to the NIH and got that as well, but because he got both of them, he had to choose which one to use. And so he had to turn down his K grant and do the Wellcome Trust grant. And he is in Uganda collecting samples and recontacting and doing genetics of depression. And many of our former Ginger Fellows you see listed here are now co-Is on many of the future projects that have happened because of NeuroGap. So with that, I'm actually going to close and open for questions. I want to say, as I started, that this is a large collaborative effort. We cannot fit all the names on the slide, but it is a large collaborative effort. And I'd love to open the floor for questions about the research to Dr. Akena. He can also talk a little bit about his experience with the Ginger program if he's willing, and any questions that you guys might have. Thank you.